Thomas wrote about halfway technologies, treatments that really weren't definitive because we simply didn't have a firm enough base in biological science to design the interventions that would make a big difference. I've never lost that uneasy sense that clinical epidemiology is often clinical epiphenomenology, and that the ideal of evidence-based medicine will always be limited in impact so long as the evidence is fundamentally constrained by our collective ignorance about the underlying causes and mechanisms of human disease. Now you may say in response, what about clinical trials? Let's first acknowledge that health practitioners have always done less than rigorous trials of therapy with individual patients. And if you take a glance at the wonderful online James Lind library, you'll find many accounts of pioneers conducting what today could be described as crossover studies or comparative trials of some description. But really, it's arguable that it was not until the Second World War that randomized trials were conducted in a manner that seems reasonably familiar to modern readers. 4 trials in particular helped lay the foundations for modern randomized blinded studies. One involved a mycotoxin to treat the common cold, unsurprisingly, negative results. 3 others involved streptomycin and other drugs to treat varied manifestations of tuberculosis. All were designed primarily by Austin Bradford Hill, Professor of Medical Statistics at the London School of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene. Bradford Hill wrote about these methods eloquently, but they spread rather slowly. The swinging 60s saw growing criticism of these unfounded medical practices, and by 1971, the time was ripe for a definitive iconoclastic blast. The iconoclast who delivered it was somewhat unexpected, a Scottish pulmonologist and public health specialist named Archie Cochrane. His rock-carling lectures skewered the prevalence of poorly validated practices, called for widespread use of rigorous randomized trials to test treatments, and also advocated for systematic reviews of randomized trials to see what the totality of research evidence told us about various treatments. Cochrane's small volume, probably unknown to many in the room, actually had a huge influence in the Anglosphere. It galvanized the development of the discipline of clinical epidemiology and laid the cornerstone for what became known as evidence-based medicine. Cochrane today is memorialized through the Cochrane Collaboration, now in its 25th year of existence. Cochrane Centers exist around the world, covering a huge range of specialties, and they are all dedicated to the continuous quantitative synthesis of relevant randomized trial data. Along with improving randomized trials, a variety of new applications of quantitative methods to clinical care were further developed and championed brilliantly by David Sackett and his colleagues at McMaster during the 1970s and 1980s. Alvin Feinstein at Yale was another enormously prolific and influential champion of the application of epidemiology and psychometric concepts to deepen our understanding of health and illness. During this Camelot period, a consensus emerged broadly that most clinical trials were too small for reasonable conclusions to be drawn from them. And so in the 1980s and 1990s, more and more trials were undertaken at massive scale. That was particularly important when mortality was the endpoint at stake, so small differences would matter. And specialties like cardiology and oncology were particularly well organized and formed massive consortia to test new treatments with big randomized trials.